Good evening and welcome to tonight's online community forum. My name is Pamela Duncan and I am the president and CEO of the Metropolitan Development Council. We partner with great joy with the Tacoma Urban League, and my cohort, Senator-elect Twyna Nobles, is here for these weekly Straight Talk conversations. We are also joined by the lovely Amanda Westbrook, who serves as our moderator and will be moderating tonight's conversation. Twyna.
Thank you, Pam. Everyone, tonight's conversation is the 29th in a series of discussions where we are diving into the different ways that COVID-19 is impacting Tacoma and Pierce County. Tonight, we have Tacoma Housing Authority CEO Michael Mirra joining us to talk about work going on in our community to try to address the impacts of the upcoming end of the statewide eviction moratorium, while people continue to deal with the impacts of COVID-19 in this pandemic. Pam, I'll turn it back over to you.
Sure. We'll be here for the community throughout the COVID-19 pandemic. And we have new conversations every single Monday at 5 p.m. And these are conversations with a purpose. The most important message throughout the series of conversations is that there is hope for our community. Our focus is to create space in each meeting to talk about resources and things that we can all be doing to help get us through this pandemic. Miss Amanda.
Thank you, Pam. We would like to take a moment to acknowledge that this meeting is being conducted on the indigenous lands of the Puyallup people. We gratefully acknowledge that we rest on the traditional lands of the Puyallup people, where they make their home and speak the Lushootseed language. Throughout today's conversation, you can submit your questions to be addressed by our speaker using the Q&A function in Zoom. We cannot promise that we will have time to consider every question, but as always, we will make our best effort to get to our list in our allotted time. First of all, everybody here, and as always, we want to check in with each of you, including Pam and Tawana, and of course, our guest, Michael Mirra, to see how you are holding up today. In other words, how is your heart? And as Pam has taught me and taught us, silence is moved by the Spirit. So during this next hour, I will not be calling on you. I will let you speak up as you see and feel fit.
So I am happy to go first because I also want to acknowledge that we are having some connection issues, and we will make those adjustments while I respond and Michael Mirra. And I will say, Amanda, thank you for always being so intentional to ask how is my heart? How are our hearts doing? Because we are in such a very tough time. And in a normal year, this is a tough time for a lot of folks for a lot of different reasons anyway. And so we continue to have things that are just piling up and making things tougher and tougher and tougher. So I will say that I am both sensitive to what people are feeling as we feel like we're kind of getting to the end of getting to the finish line for 2020. And I'm encouraged by the support that we all show one another. And, you know, I had an opportunity to just get away and be down on the water this past weekend. And that really did so much good for my soul and my spirit. I'll turn it over to Michael.
Thank you, Pam and Amanda. I'll speak for THA and say that perhaps as the rest of you feel, we're in the middle of a big, high stakes experiment in improvisation and having to relearn how we do our work in the middle of a pandemic. So we feel a little off balance, but getting the work done. And keenly aware that the hardship and suffering in the community is spreading and getting deeper.
Rob, I would love to check in with you and to see how you are doing.
Sure. So like others on this call, I feel like we are in the middle of a long journey, and I'm sure with the coming few weeks have some twists and turns that we're not aware of yet, that are yet to reveal themselves. And I'm thankful for having a short break over the weekend to be able to kind of regain some strength and focus, and look forward to the opportunity to try to make this abnormal situation bearable and survivable for our community.
Thank you, Rob. Thank you. Pam, I'm wondering if you can help set up tonight's conversation. I know that MDC has hosted a couple of large stakeholder meetings to talk about strategies to help our community deal with the potential impacts at the end of the eviction moratorium on December 31st. What is the purpose of those meetings?
Thank you for asking that question, and that's a great way to set up this conversation, Amanda. It became evident as we were navigating our way through the pandemic and hearing about all of these new and different terms that we had never had in our vocabulary before, like flatten the curve and eviction moratorium and PPEs and things that all of this new language that had not really existed prior to the pandemic. And with the moratorium, what we were hearing so much about was what it meant for the tenants, that it was a way to ensure that tenants, renters were not being evicted because so many people have been impacted economically as a result of the pandemic. So that's great. That was very much needed. And the governor issued the moratorium that was subsequently extended and then extended again, right? What we were not hearing so much of what were the voices of housing providers and how that impacts housing providers. We also recognize that the ending of the moratorium is an inevitability. And what happens then when it ends? And even with the very substantial amount of funding that came into our community to provide rental assistance for folks, we know that people are still at risk of being evicted, because if they received 3 months or 4 months worth of rental assistance, but they're 5 months behind, they're still behind. And we know that we are potentially on the verge of seeing a huge public health, public safety crisis with mass evictions that could occur as a result of the end of the moratorium. And we wanted to provide a space where not only tenant advocates could speak, but also housing provider advocates, and could elevate here's what this looks like for us. Here's the impact for us. It's not just a one-sided situation. So that was the whole intention, and to figure out how we strategize to offset the impacts. And as a result of two very large conversations and then a subsequent smaller conversation, we were able to identify common themes that we heard over and over and over again, and also common strategic actions that need to be undertaken. So that was the whole purpose of bringing folks together to have these conversations. We cannot hear you, Amanda.
There we go. So sorry. Gosh, you would think after almost 30 episodes, I'd get the mute button down pat, but COVID brain. What I wanted to say was I want to ask the follow-up question of what did you hear over and over again? But I also want to bring Michael into this conversation, and I know that question will be answered. So as I stated, and as we all know and we live it in our hearts, the Washington State eviction moratorium is set to expire December 31st, 2020. So Michael and Pam, do either of you have a sense of whether that date is likely to be extended, and what is likely to happen next? And Michael, I'm going to start with you first.
Thank you, Amanda. I do not have any insight into the governor's intentions. I know that there are discussions underway that he has convened to inform him on what to do next. Some of the themes of that discussion include whether to extend it or not, if to extend it on what terms. Should the terms try to distinguish, as the Center for Disease Control federal moratorium attempted to do, between tenants who are behind on the rent because they could not pay and tenants who are behind on the rent because they wouldn't pay? I don't know what that would look like if they made that attempt. But Pam's right, at some point, the moratorium will end. If not on New Year's Eve, then sometime later. As to what then would happen, I think some observations are in order. And the first is that even before the pandemic, our housing market was not working for large segments of our population. Before the pandemic, large portions of the rental population could not afford where they were living. Their rent was too high for their income. And a significant number of our residents didn't have any place to live. If we were talking about food instead of housing, we would recognize widespread malnutrition with pockets of starvation. But talking about housing, we recognize extensive rent burden with notable measures of homelessness. The pandemic has made this worse in a number of notable ways. The economic shutdown has created large numbers of newly impoverished households because they lost their income. And the eviction moratorium has spared people from eviction, but it has not stopped the accumulation of rent arrearages. So when the moratorium ends, people will still be vulnerable to eviction. Another problem the pandemic has made worse is landlords have gone without rent collection, and smaller landlords are fragile as well. And then there's this. The secondary literature from the real estate industry is anticipating that large real estate investment funds are looking to buy up distressed properties. And if that happens, even more of our rental population that may be naturally affordable will pass into speculative, largely out-of-state ownership. That's what happened after the Great Recession. And if we're headed for more of it, that would not be a good thing. And we would lose some of our natural affordability among the private rental market. So the pandemic didn't create a lot of these trajectories, but has made them worse.
And what would you add to that?
I mean, in terms of what the situation looks like, Michael very succinctly said it all. It's there are impacts all the way around. What we didn't hear is how there is a ripple effect that extends out beyond solely the renters or those housing providers, because it then begins to impact other parts of our community when people are not able to pay their mortgage and they lose their property, and then it impacts their credit, it impacts their ability, their bankability, it impacts banks, it impacts our larger economy, it impacts the schools, because children are in these households who are now being displaced, and it just goes on and on and on. So in terms of the extension of the impacts, it's pretty widespread. It's not just a two-sided issue.
Pam is right. It is hard to talk about almost any other civic interest without talking about housing. Housing and education, housing and child welfare, mental health services, physical health services, housing and transportation, wage progression, housing and the justice system. And the pandemic has taught us that housing is not only necessary for health, but public health. And we should expect that if at the end of the moratorium, we see a notable increase in displacement and homelessness, it will be an added strain on all those other systems.
Well said in terms of what both of you had to say here. You know, my other question is, Michael, as you continue to hear about the potential impacts on the end of the moratorium here in Pierce County, how is this likely to impact the clients that you are working with within the Tacoma Housing Authority?
Amanda, it's a good question. I think our clients are the lucky ones. The families we rent to, for whom we are landlords, are lucky because we are backfilling their rent as their income goes down. Our voucher holders are lucky because we're paying their rent to their landlord in increasing amounts as their income goes down. Our voucher partners are lucky. Rob, what should we do?
So I've muted Amanda's mic, so you should be able to go on.
We're fine now.
And our voucher partners are lucky because while some of their other tenants may be defaulting on rent, if they're renting to one of our voucher holders, we're paying our share of the rent in full and on time and in increasing amounts. So Amanda, I don't think THA is the right sample to look at to determine the extent of the hardship. The ones that I think are better to look at are the ones we do not serve.
I would echo that. One of the things that made MDC really consider stepping into this space and convening is that MDC is both a provider of services and a housing provider. And similar to Tacoma Housing Authority, those who we are serving are receiving those wraparound supports. And as Michael said, that might not be the best sample to look at when the folks we serve are already receiving vouchers and are also receiving rental assistance. But when you look at the larger community of those who are not necessarily part of our client base.
So this goes back to a question, Pam, I asked you earlier about some of the stakeholder meetings that you've been having. So what kinds of ideas have stakeholders shared so far about how our community can avoid and also help avoid the evictions in January?
There were several themes that were constantly elevated about concerns, and then several common strategies that need to be undertaken. So constantly what we heard is that it is just as important for housing providers to be able to communicate with renters and for renters to be responsive to those communications, because none of the voices we heard on behalf of the housing providers were saying, we just really want to serve mass evictions. That we did not hear that. People were saying that it's really in everyone's best interest to be able to shore up the rental arrearages. Housing providers said, we don't go into this business to evict people. There's really a huge investment that's being made. So it's important, again, that communication happens. And we know that that is in part already happening, and that the communication happens with cultural sensitivity to those who are being housed. In terms of some of the strategic actions that were really illuminated, there is definitely a need for there to be an elevation of this issue. So it's not solely those of us who are in this work day in and day out who understand the impacts of the eviction, and that we really need to have our elected officials also at the forefront and speaking out about this. We talked about how important it is, and what we're seeing right now, Tacoma Pro Bono and the Center for Dialogue and Resolution is actively involved in ensuring that our those who are in rental properties have a place where they can feel safe and be able to navigate through whatever their concerns are. I will say, and then I'm going to just turn it over to Michael. We also heard, however, from property owners, housing providers, the concerns around some folks who just simply stopped paying rent, and not because they necessarily had an economic impact. And that there's also the issue of where it's a safety issue and there is some behavior issue for a tenant that makes it unsafe, that makes that rental unsafe for the surrounding tenants? And so how do those things get addressed? Michael, what would you add that you heard during these discussions?
I think an important insight that property managers and property owners who rent property offered is Pam's right. They don't make money evicting people. And the worse than a tenant who's not paying rent or who is being troublesome is a vacancy for a landlord, because they're expensive. And for a landlord to evict because of an arrearage must be because the landlord is betting that he or she could find a replacement tenant soon enough to pay full rent. So what that means is a landlord is looking more forward than backwards. They're not looking back towards recouping the rent arrearage as much as they are looking forward for assurance that someone is going to pay them rent. In a better situation with more assistance from Congress for rental assistance help, that would be a big part of the solution, to offer that assurance. The worrisome part of this picture is when the moratorium ends will be for those tenants, not only with arrearages, but who cannot offer their landlords adequate assurance that they could resume payment. And landlords who are themselves in a fragile situation are probably having a comparable experience with their mortgage lenders.
Go ahead, Pam.
Yeah, I can anticipate what your next question is going to be, but I want to just also call out a few other things that we heard as we talked about this particular issue. So again, first and foremost is that there is a prevention of evictions and foreclosures, both of those things, and that whatever assistance is being provided must be provided to ensure the stability of the tenants and the housing providers. In other words, that we are not throwing good money after bad, or the money is just going into a black hole. I mentioned about communications. I mentioned about the partnership in terms of resolution for both sides. A couple of other things that really came up is about how this issue elevates the need for long-term building community wealth, and that we really open up more home ownership opportunities to help people build their own personal and household wealth and budgeting education. And that also, in terms, one of the common themes we heard is that of stewardship, and that trust is being built across the sectors. And that we also strengthen existing programs. So I wanted to just really highlight that these were things that we were hearing as we were having these discussions.
Thank you, Pam. I want to pause the conversation because we have a question that came in from somebody in our audience. I want to say thank you to Carrie for this question. And this is the question that she has. Is there anything that can be done for those agencies served who are on wait lists or who qualify but have not gotten lucky enough to get onto a wait list yet, but are not in arrears and need to qualify for the CARES Act, yet still extremely rent burdened and now facing dramatically increased costs in other areas such as food, other services, and may have lost other support due to survival social networks being impacted by job loss, etc. Even $50 to $200 a month could prevent potential evictions. So what is done? What is being done for those agencies who are, or those agency people who are on a wait list right now, or who that qualify but have not gotten lucky enough to get on that wait list? And Michael, I'll let you start with that.
And Michael, you're muted right now.
Sorry, Rob. There is cash assistance available through the county that comes to the county through the state, ultimately from Congress, a little bit from the state government. The county's number to inquire about that assistance is 798-4500. It's the Department of Human Services. The other forms of assistance are available from the normal sources. A good place to start is United Way's 211 number. But I think this is going to be the weakness in the situation, because there's not enough of this assistance in comparison with the need. There's not even enough in comparison with the size of the arrearage. And if the arrearage continues to grow, the shortfall will grow. And I wish I could have more to offer. The Tacoma Housing Authority, for example, is not taking anybody off our waiting lists. We are backfilling lost income from the people we presently serve. That's not sustainable, but it's the right thing to do right now. And we don't anticipate taking people off our waiting list anytime soon.
Michael, thank you for that. Pam, is there anything that you want to add to what Michael said?
Actually, and sadly, no, that's the resources that I would have called out as well. I will say that that's what comes to mind immediately about cash resources. However, when it comes to food, we know that there's been much investment in our community into the emergency food network. And again, calling United Way's 211 helpline is the best way to find out about other resources that can offset that cash outlay for folks.
So I want to go back to our conversation when we were talking about the reflections and the ruminations that were heard in those stakeholder meetings. And I'm going to ask a tough question right now. So who are the stakeholders that you haven't heard from yet?
I'm happy to start with that and then Michael jump in. So we know that we have not heard from the lending institutions, especially the mortgage holders. And right now, what we are seeing is that there's a lot of cash assistance for the tenants. I will also say that I heard from Representative Mari Levitt today, and she just gave me a quick FYI that there is a legislative group that has been meeting on foreclosure issues that includes lenders, foreclosure counselors, etc. And that conversation is ongoing to determine what might be needed as a fix as well. So that's very good to hear, because there's this other side of this whole equation that hasn't really, we have not had as much visibility from that side. Basically, the mortgage lenders and what will they need or what are they inclined to do to help ensure that folks don't begin losing their properties as a result of that.
Michael, who have you not heard from in terms of your stakeholder arena?
THA has had good communication with our landlord partners. We have also been communicating with our clients and letting them know we are available to backfill their income losses. I would have to say the people I'm worried about are the ones who never get to us, who don't apply because they know we work off these hideous waiting lists, who know that even if they got to us, we don't have anything to offer them. So there's a good part of this unfolding tragedy that's silent.
That makes me take a deep breath, because that silence, all you have to do is step outside your front door, and it's deafening to see the increase of people at 5:38 in the evening when it's dark and the temperature is dropping and they have no place to go. So as we balance out this conversation, is the focus of this conversation about recovering rent that is past due, that's been accrued during the moratorium, or is it more about looking forward to 2021? Or is it both? Go ahead, Michael.
I think the best use of rental assistance dollars available from the city, the county, the state, or the federal government is to purchase stability. That spending scarce dollars for the purpose of paying off a portion of the arrearage, leaving an unpaid balance, making the family vulnerable to eviction, is not a good use of that money unless it comes with some assurance that the tenancy will continue.
So, Michael, how does that happen? Like in terms of the implementation of what you just said, is that looking at each particular household situation and making a call about who receives assistance and who doesn't?
It's easy to envision, Pam, how rental assistance programs might be fashioned for that purpose. And it would essentially go like this. It offers the landlord some payment against the arrearage, which the landlord's never going to see otherwise because the tenant doesn't have the money, in exchange for some assurance from the landlord that the tenancy will continue. And the landlord would be able to provide that assurance more readily if the rental assistance also paid forward. Again, the main uncertainty here is whether there's rental assistance dollars enough for the purpose.
So the conversation that Michael and I have had goes beyond what he just shared about the assistance going to the property owner on behalf of the tenant. But if it's just some assistance, then on the other end is the mortgage holder, and the mortgage holder isn't, to the best of my knowledge at this point, isn't happy with some payment. The mortgage holder wants full payment. And so I always think that has to be those lenders have to be part of this conversation to be so that we're all walking lockstep about what's an acceptable payment and then what happens. And do we also need to have the feds come in and shore up the banks on for those property owners? Will the bank accept 80% from the property owner, and then the feds or someone comes in and pays that other 20%? Like, that's the part of the conversation that so far we haven't had. And I don't know if anyone is having that conversation.
That is a very astute observation that Pam just offered us. And a mortgage is a complex transaction. It's not only the lender and the borrower, it's the federal government insuring the mortgage. And the terms of that insurance should give the federal government some influence over what flexibility the lender can or should provide. But if the federal government does not exercise that influence, I don't know if a lender would have any incentive knowing that they're insured.
Well,
So
and I want
Pam
to
is
jump
right.
in because Rob brought up a really good point. I'm going to call him out for this in the chat. And that is because he's so intelligent. And that is that this December 31st deadline also puts a false sense of an urgency on this money, does it not?
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm.
Yeah, there are two urgencies with that deadline. One is that's when the moratorium presently expires. That is also the deadline for the expenditure of the CARES Act money available for the purpose. And both deadlines make January very uncertain.
And actually the deadline is December 30th. It's not even December 31st. I mean, go figure. But it's as Rob elevates that there's the real deadline, that hard deadline that's coming up. And there's this, we've been operating as though once the clock turns to January 1, 2021, that we'll be okay. And we know that nothing could be further from the truth. So it is really a very serious and far-reaching, a situation has far-reaching implications well beyond the end of this year. And we know, I'll just say this last thing, we know we don't want to see people displaced, period. We're all in that business of caring about people being housed, and we don't want to see people displaced, period. And now we're talking about potentially massive evictions.
And as Rob just also put in the chat, Rob, I just think you should jump in and take your mic off here, is that these dollars, Congress thought by April we'd be over and done with. Am I right, Rob?
Yeah, I mean, I think it's important just to remember that when these dollars were approved back in March or April, very few people anticipated that we'd be sitting where we are now in December, that we wouldn't have a national approach to this crisis being COVID, but also the housing crisis.
In the chat, and it leads me to my next question about what our community can be doing or what we can be doing. And I just got that awful band and my internet connection is unstable. So I'm going to try to speak very slowly so you can get all of my words in. Here is the question. And again, it's from lovely Carrie, who asked the previous question. Many are also reluctant. Why? Because in this tight market, they don't want landlords / lenders to know that they are floundering. What can we as a community do to remove the shame, stigma, and prevent possible retaliation against tenants seeking assistance? So I'm going to ask that question first, and I'm going to ask the question about what can we do as a community. So Pam, would you like to start with that answer?
Tacoma Pro Bono is the first place that I would recommend that people contact. We had them on our session last week, and we'll post that information so that people will have, thank you, Rob, a phone number to call, but they are very actively working to be that resource for folks who need assistance. And I'm sure they don't have any problem with that number being widely circulated.
Another portal into that whole effort would be the Center of Dialogue and Resolution. Under the direction and leadership of our state Supreme Court, the superior courts of 6 counties have fashioned a mediation effort to try and divert cases out of the eviction court docket and get landlords and tenants talking and connected with available rental assistance dollars. And they are eager to start this before the eviction moratorium ends. The Center for Dialogue and Resolution and Tacoma Pro Bono know how to put people in touch so that they can have a safe conversation with their landlord. And maybe that would be a way to deflect the shame and the fear that Carrie is describing.
Well said. So that leads me to one of our last few questions here, and that is, what are the next steps? Are there things that our community can be doing to really impact this situation? Or is this something that is bigger than one county can tackle? Michael.
There is not a community in the country who is ready for what's about to happen. And it really calls out for a response by the national government.
I'd like to add something. What we haven't talked about in regards to the impacts of the eviction moratorium is the disparate impacts. And we already know that households of color, Black and brown households in particular, have already been the ones that are disproportionately impacted by evictions. And that impact has long-lasting effects on that household, because now the household has an eviction on their record, and it makes it more difficult for them to get into housing. And when we talk about housing, it's important that we not only talk about the affordability of housing. I call it the 3 A's. It's not only the affordability of the housing, it is what's available of that housing, which is affordable. And then for that which is available, is it actually accessible to folks who are in need of the housing? Because if they have an eviction or a conviction, or they have poor credit, or they just don't have the cash outlay, it's not accessible to them. So now that was already the case. We were already having a housing crisis. And with the advent of mass evictions, where are people going to go? Where would people go? And if we're talking about across the country, where are people going to go? It would be, housing is a basic fundamental human right, and we have to just be considering how we get in front of this and stave off, a huge crisis. That's even, and it will be even more so of a health crisis because we are still in a pandemic. And we've already talked about what that looks like and the effects, the disparate impacts on communities of color.
There is not an area within someone's life that this will not touch, if not start to deteriorate, if something is not done come December 30th. There's just not, you lose your home. It is a spiral from that moment on. We have given, go ahead, Ms. Pam, yes.
So you've asked this question a couple of times, and that question is, what do we think the governor is going to do? What do we think is going to happen? We cannot have people be evicted. We cannot have the mass evictions. And at the same time, we have to ensure that we shore up those housing providers who have obligations as well, lest they lose their properties and then people get evicted because they lost their properties. So we have to be very vocal advocates, calling and talking to all of our elected officials, whether it's locally, it's on the state level, and even nationally about this issue, because it will create us, there will be a tsunami effect that we just can't have. We cannot have this. Can't hear you.
This question I'm going to ask has been answered in the past 50 minutes, but I want to ask it again because I don't think that people can hear it enough. And if someone is just joining, I want them to hear the answer. If somebody is not able to pay their rent right now, and they're afraid that they could be impacted by an eviction, what steps can they take right now, or should they be taking Tuesday, tomorrow morning?
The eviction moratorium lasts through the end of December. So if the reason for their vulnerability to eviction is because they can't pay the rent, then they will not be evicted on Tuesday. The range of evictions permissible under that moratorium are pretty narrow. And if they get threatened with eviction for reasons that the moratorium should preclude, they should call Tacoma pro bono. Although they're wise to look ahead to the end of the moratorium, and I think a wise thing to do would be to talk to their landlords and plan for it and try to come to an agreement on a payment schedule for the arrearage and payments going forward, and to help them with those discussions, which can be scary. The Center for Dialogue and Resolution is available with mediators.
Pam, what would you do to fix this?
We really need more time. I know that a lot of folks don't want to hear about extending the moratorium, but it buys us time. And so in my estimation, the moratorium has to be extended. And I understand, as an organization that has property and as an individual who has property, I understand what it means. You have to be able to take care of your obligations. And I want to see the feds also actively participate and not wait till the last minute and come in and assist the banks, the mortgage holders, the lenders, so that our housing providers can also be able to operate without, an axe over their head about what happens to my property. So it was really good to hear Representative Levitt mention that there is already underway some action to stave off foreclosures.
Yes, it is good to hear that. I mean, that helps me feel like everybody is being looked at, because nobody wins in this. There's no winner. Nobody is walking away with piles of cash. That's not happening right now. We want to end our time together, as we often do, on a hopeful note, because the one thing that we have promised throughout the history of this series is that we are here to focus on hope, and we are here to give solutions. So can each of you, and Rob, I'm going to call you out on this as well, because you've been so vital in this conversation. Can each of you share where you are finding hope right now?
The conversations that Pam has convened, I thought, had a hopeful theme to them. It was a recognition that we are facing a communal disaster and we should face it as a community. That was a hopeful posture. I'm not sure where it will lead us, but it was certainly a necessary sentiment if we were going to get somewhere.
One thing that I would add from those conversations that I found hopeful was to, at least from the representatives who we had at those stakeholder meetings, the housing providers, the property owners, were pretty clear that they were looking for ways forward. And as we've already said during this call, they're not in the business that they're in to evict people. So there's not an intention to make the situation worse. It's just a struggle to come up with the solutions that can make people get through this situation.
Guess it's on me. So what I did, as I am often inclined to do, is just sometimes go and pull up the word that we're talking about and give and speak about the definition. And so hope is an optimistic state of mind that is based on an expectation of positive outcomes with respect to events and circumstances in one's life or the world at large. What I know about hope is that it's the seed that we all have in us that we use that really helps to manifest something in our life, in our world. And I hold out much hope for our entire communities to figure this out. This is what I think about when I think about America, that we are determined and we have the guts and the gumption to figure things out for the benefit of our communities. So that gives me hope. It gives me hope when we are having not just these conversations, but when we all come together and put our minds to it and say, we know we can figure this out. And I am absolutely convicted that we can all figure this out.
Beautifully said, Pam. Well, according to my clock, it is 6:01, and that means it's time for Pamela Duncan to drive us home and tuck us in for the evening.
I think I've already said it. I absolutely have no doubt in my mind that we will figure this out. And so we will just keep at it. We will keep doing the good work that needs to be done for our community and for those folks whose voices we don't necessarily hear. That's why we are here in this setting, and we will figure this out. And with that, I will just say thank you.
All right. Well, we want to say
Everyone.
thank you.
Yep. Michael, thank you so much for joining. We appreciate that you were able to join us. And Rob, our impromptu guest panelist, thank you so much for joining us. And as always, Amanda, thank you too. And for everyone who joined us, whether you were on the Zoom call or Facebook Live, thank you so much again for joining us, and have a good evening. Good night.
Good night.